right, I will get us going. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Teaching and Learning Center's Professional Development Series. I'm Don Saucier. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of the Teaching and Learning Center. We had a couple of announcements before we kick it over to our presenter for today that we're very excited about. First of all, you found us. This is the Professional Development Series. We give certificates, and you can even be a TLC Fellow. And if you want to know how, my colleagues just dropped that link into the chat so you can check that out. We also have a SOTO showcase coming up. SOTO stands for Scholarship on Teaching and Learning. And we have an event where we want people to share lots of the stuff that they've done related to research, related to teaching, innovation in teaching. In the Monday of finals week, and that just got dropped into the chat too, the submission for that is due next Wednesday. So next Wednesday, when I say, hey, get those in, I'll be talking about today. But for now, it's next Wednesday that those will be due. And if you have questions, please reach out. We want to have a lot of opportunity for people to share the cool stuff that we're doing. Third, there is a course design workshop that Leadership Studies is hosting. They're bringing Lori Niffen from Fort Hays State University, and it'll be on service learning and infusing that in your classrooms. And my colleagues just dropped that information in the chat there too. That is going to be Monday afternoon, April 10th from 1:30 to 3:30. In the final 30 minutes, you're going to actually get to workshop on your own syllabus, how to put service learning into there. So lots of really cool things coming up. Lots of people doing excellent stuff. Next week, the event is going to be called Rhythm is Plaid by LB Wigfall and Andy Faber. Really looking forward to that. What that means, I'm not even sure, but it's going to be awesome next week. Has something to do with like how music works and things, and I'm not a music person, so I can't quite understand, but it's going to be really cool about how we put things out in terms of rhythms for our students. All of that's upcoming, but what we got right now is a really cool event. Dr. Deepak Subramony from the College of Education is going to be talking to us about how to better engage students in our online courses, and we are so excited to have you, Dr. Subramony. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Don, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm truly honored by your presence, and I'll try to make it worth your while. So without further ado, let me go ahead and try to get my screen share going. All right. Okay, I don't know why it's doing that. I don't understand why it's not letting me share. So, I mean, is the like, do you have any kind of a?
You should have permission to do it. I don't know much beyond that. It might be the actual screen you're choosing.
Okay, no, it's like it just basically won't even let me begin the process of sharing the screen. So let me try another way. Let me go into my system preferences and see if I can do something there.
So is Dr. Subramony a co-host of the event, Ashley?
No, but I can make him one.
All right, let's do that and see if that helps.
That might make a difference.
Okay, that
All
should
right, you are now the host.
over.
Let's see if that works.
Let's see if that makes a difference. Or I might, okay, I might. Or I might try to just log out and log back in, the worst case scenario, to see if that. Okay. I'm sorry, guys. I didn't expect.
Dr. Subramony, if you have like a presentation you want to email me, then I could share it, I think. Okay,
let me do that. Okay, Trina, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, give me a second. Let me just try doing that. That might just solve the problem for the moment. Okay. Trina. Yep, I just sent it to you, and let me know if you get it and if you're able to.
Okay, as soon as that comes, I will let you know.
Okay.
Not seeing it in my email quite yet. There we go.
Okay, that worked from your end. I'm so relieved.
Yeah, just
All
say next or whatever when you're ready for me to move through.
Sure. And yeah, it's like it kind of goes one by one. So I'll just, I mean, as soon as I'm done with one point, you can just move on to the next one. I mean, we'll just kind of take it as we go. So so once again, welcome to today's session. Sorry for the time we've lost so far. Hopefully I can make up for that. So we're going to talk about how to better engage our learners in the online courses we teach. So moving on. Yeah. So as you all know, back in March 2020, like, K-State and pretty much every other academic institution out there had to switch overnight, literally, to emergency remote teaching because of the pandemic. And this led to the development of an entire new kind of area of teaching and learning called pandemic pedagogy that people have been talking about. It's become like a buzzword since 2020. And so I see us now in a post-pandemic pedagogy environment because the pandemic is still here. It's not going anywhere. At the same time, like, we've gone back to business as usual in most cases. However, there have been some changes that have happened since the pre-pandemic era. And that's why I call it post-pandemic pedagogy in that sense. So moving on. So what do we do now? We now have to be willing and able to foster student learning across varied settings and modalities. So we can no longer be married to just face-to-face or something else. We have to be willing to be flexible, and we have to be able to quickly pivot between these settings and modalities based on what the pandemic does or what something else that happens or any decisions taken by institutions. So in this scenario, in this post-pandemic pedagogy scenario, what becomes foregrounded is the importance of engaging our students in online courses and online settings, because online is now here to stay and it's not going anywhere. It's only going to get more and more pervasive. So the first question that we have to ask is, like, what exactly is engagement? Like, how do we know that our students are engaged, and what is it and how do we do it? And so you look at the literature on teaching and learning, and it reveals engagement as being a multi-dimensional construct. So there's engagement with the content, the course content, there's engagement with the instructor, you and me, and there's engagement with fellow learners. So it's a multi-dimensional construct. One of the things for us to understand basically in this context is that learners can pretty much learn anything online, but only teachers can offer accountability, structure, and guidance to that experience. And that's where we come in. And that's why our being able to effectively engage our students is so important. And so, I mean, we are academics. I mean, like, we have traditionally taught face-to-face, and we are probably highly experienced at engaging our students in face-to-face settings. But the question now that's really foregrounded is, how do we effectively engage our students in distance and online settings? And so as part of this, I interviewed my own community of practice here at the College of Education, so my own colleagues basically, and I asked them some questions like, what does effective learner engagement look like to you? And how does effective learner engagement differ in face-to-face versus online or distance settings? And what do you personally do to foster effective learner engagement in your own online courses? As you can imagine, I got a set of really diverse, converging and contradictory perspectives. So there were commonalities and there were differences. And so what I'm doing here today is presenting selected responses from my community of practice, from my colleagues in the College of Education. And please understand, this is the tip of the iceberg because we have a limited amount of time here and there's a lot of data. So I had to pick and choose. And the other thing I've done is that I'm framing these responses using a set of key theoretical lenses from the teaching and learning literature. And that helps us ground our praxis in theory, and which is so important for us to do, as you all already know. Okay, so moving on, the first lens I want to use is cognitive constructivism. And this goes back to Jean Piaget's work in 1968, where he proposed that the learner actively constructs their own knowledge from the content, from the instruction, rather than just passively reacting to stimuli. Because understand, before this, the prevalent learning theory was behaviorism, which is stimulus response, like, Pavlov's dogs. And so from the behaviorist perspective, the learner was primarily passive. Things were done to the learner and the learner responded, reacted. And with cognitivism, we moved from that model to a model where the learner actively is involved in making sense of content and internalizing the content and making meanings out of it. And so many of the responses I got from my colleagues regarding, the effective engagement of online learners had to do with cognitive constructivist ideas. And so one was that learners engage in diverse ways and are engaged by different things and activities. So there may not be a one-size-fits-all solution to, foster learner engagement across the board. I mean, we have to be willing to acknowledge that cognitive diversity and be able to, allow for it. An engaged learner owns the instructional content and gets everything that they can out of it. They identify with it and they take ownership of it. An engaged learner displays curiosity by exhaustively exploring the various pertinent issues that are raised in the course and relate to the course content. An engaged learner displays critical thinking. They challenge prevalent assumptions regarding the instructional content. So, as we know, so much of academia involves either unstated or unexamined assumptions. And I mean, try as much as we might to adhere to the scientific method and all the other things. But the point is that there is always room for these assumptions to be challenged, to be examined, to be reviewed. And so an engaged learner is someone who's actually able and willing to do that. An engaged learner poses novel questions in class. They put forward novel perspectives regarding these pertinent issues. And for all these reasons, we ought to consider adding content that is learner-generated, learner-recommended into our curriculum, especially when we have graduate courses. Like, for example, here at the College of Education, our graduate students are basically highly qualified and accomplished professionals themselves out in the school districts and other places. And so they have a wealth of knowledge and content that they can bring in. And when we respect that, acknowledge that, and incorporate that, then we allow them to have more of a sense of ownership over the content, which in turn enhances engagement. Moving on. The other theoretical lens is social conservatism, constructivism, and talk about a Freudian slip there. So cognitive constructivism was about moving away from passive stimulus response behavioral theories of learning to a more active learner concept. And so the cognitive constructivists say that the learner actively constructs their own knowledge based on information coming in and then owns that knowledge. And Lev Vygotsky, who started the social constructivism ball rolling, he furthers cognitive constructivist thinking by emphasizing the collaborative nature of much learning. The idea that we are social beings and we are social learners, and we learn optimally in situations where we can optimize our collective intelligence and be able to learn off of each other and from each other. And many of the responses I received from my colleagues also spoke to social constructivist ideas. For example, the idea that engaged learners must actively interact with each other, and therefore we must provide opportunities for this, which is easier said than done, because with face-to-face, it's logistically it's a lot easier than doing it online. Moving on. And the idea that unscaffolded discussions can rapidly lose meaning. And this goes back to constructivism, which is that the learner does construct their own meanings. At the same time, our job as teachers is to provide guidance, to provide a scaffold that allows them to effectively and appropriately create meaning, rather than have things happen that we don't foresee or don't want. And so that's the guidance aspect. We talked about the guidance and the accountability and the structure. And so this is part of guidance, providing scaffolds to discussions in order to allow for meaningful construction of knowledge. Moving on. And for learners to be engaged, they must participate in communities of learning and praxis while learning. And our job as teachers is to foster the development of these communities of learning and praxis. And that's part of the structure, that we allow for these communities to exist so that within that structure, social constructivist learning can occur. Moving on. And we have to understand that collaborative learning is not just having people form teams or groups and doing stuff in groups, group discussions or group or team projects or whatever. That can create as many problems as it can solve. There's issues of group dynamics, power differentials, logistics, and so on. And so our job with any kind of group work or team work that we assign to our students is to ensure accountability in that process. Once again, easier said than done. And also the idea that learners can enhance their own learning by helping their peers. And so that when you teach somebody a concept or a principle or a procedure, you reinforce your own knowledge of it, and you often get much better at retaining that knowledge. And so the idea is that in order to foster engagement, we have to tangibly incentivize reflective peer review among our learners, where they actually get to look at each other's work and constructively critique them, and not in terms of what's wrong with the other person's work, but rather what can I learn from their work, from their perspective, from what they've done. Moving on. And the next theoretical lens I want to use to interpret the responses I got from my colleagues is that of context analysis. Now, context analysis comes from the field of instructional systems design. And Martin Tesmer and Rita Ritchie were the ones who, excuse me, put forward this concept back in 1997. And context analysis involves looking at 3 different contexts pertaining to teaching and learning: the orienting context, the instructional context, and the transfer context. What's the orienting context? The orienting context is, what are your learners coming into the learning experience with? How do they perceive it? How do they see it? What are their goals? What is their pre-existing knowledge? What attitudes and what dispositions are they bringing in with them into the learning experience? There isn't much you can do to change the orienting context of your learners, because they own their orienting context. However, you can be cognizant of it, and you can adjust your instructional strategies in a way that speaks to that orienting context. Now, the instructional context is what you personally, as an instructor, have direct control over. Not 100%, but a significant amount of control over. And you can actually own this context by creating the right setting and the right environment for effective teaching and meaningful learning to take place. And finally, the transfer context is, where do the students take this knowledge that you provided them with, and how do they apply it, and where do they apply it, and when do they apply it? So it makes a huge difference with engagement, because if you teach me Swahili and I'm not going to East Africa anytime in the foreseeable future, I mean, do I have meaningful opportunities to transfer that knowledge into real world settings? Probably not. And therefore, will I be 100% engaged in learning Swahili? I don't know. I don't think so. Maybe not. On the other hand, for example, if I live in a high crime neighborhood and I'm attending a course on self-defense, you can bet I will be engaged, because I know that the moment I step out the door, I might need to use these skills to defend myself in this area. So if you understand that, that's what transfer context is. So what about the orienting context? So things that my colleagues shared was like how the pandemic created a hierarchy of needs with our students and with ourselves, that we first have to make sure that they're okay and that they're surviving physically and mentally. I mean, you cannot have them come in the midst of a pandemic into a emergency remote teaching situation and expect them to perform at 100%. It ain't happening. We have to acknowledge that there is a hierarchy of needs here, and until they can be safe and they can be okay physically and mentally, they aren't going to be able to engage. And of course, there were other issues like, people had heard horror stories about Zoom. And so they were leery about like, the idea of like, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to now spend the rest of the semester learning on Zoom. How am I going to like that? And there is this basic fact that engagement is risky. And when you engage with strangers, you are making yourself vulnerable. And therefore, in order for our learners to be able to engage effectively with the content, with us and with their peers, they need to be able to feel safe in that learning environment. And they need to be able to have the confidence and the courage to be able to deal with potentially uncomfortable concepts and unforeseen communication barriers, both technological and other. And therefore, effective engagement requires higher levels of trust and faith among all concerned parties. And this came up a bunch of times in what my colleagues had to tell me when I interviewed them. And also the idea that the vulnerability, the safety, the trust, the faith issues are all the more challenging for minority students at historically white institutions like ours. Moving on. And this whole trust and faith and vulnerability and safety issue becomes all the more germane in online environments because we're not face-to-face, we don't see each other anymore. And so when we're learning online, we have to have faith and trust in things we cannot see. Our learners have to have faith and trust in us and our, the word isn't coming to me, our motivations, our motives. And we have to have faith and trust in their integrity and their willingness to learn. And they have to have faith and trust in each other. And that's a challenge to accomplish when we can't see each other, when there's a distance between us. And multiple respondents told me that this trust building takes even more work in asynchronous environments, because in asynchronous, like when it's 100% asynchronous, like a lot of programs and courses are, you don't ever see the instructor face-to-face unless you schedule social time outside of instructional time. You don't see your peers face-to-face unless that is actually arranged for by through a special Zoom meeting or something. And therefore, in a purely asynchronous environment, trust building takes even more work. Moving on. And another thing that came up, and now we move from the orienting context, where are our learners coming from? We move to the instructional context. And this is something that we have control over, generally speaking, as teachers. So one of the things that came up in this area is that we have to check our assumptions as to what learner engagement looks like online. That because sometimes it's not overtly observable the way we can observe it face-to-face. And we have to understand that in online synchronous situations like this one, non-verbal doesn't necessarily mean non-engaged. So, I mean, I see y'all on my right-hand column, and I can sort of sometimes make out your expressions because these are like really small tiles. And some of y'all have turned off your cameras, and so I cannot see what you're doing at all. And so we have to understand that just because we don't get verbal feedback or visual response, it doesn't mean that y'all are not engaged. Moving on. On the one hand, in synchronous online settings like this, engagement is harder to observe if learners turn off their mic and camera. But on the other hand, it is actually easier to measure engagement in asynchronous and 100% asynchronous online settings, because those settings generate documentary evidence and artifacts in the form of learner work and or like, postings on a discussion board or postings in a chat room. And so you actually have documentary evidence to be able to quantify in terms of, like, how much interaction, how much engagement was happening with students. Moving on. And so once again, on the one hand, there is more accountability to engage in face-to-face settings, because, like, you're right in front of me and you cannot be hiding your face or looking somewhere else or sleeping. I mean, like, you have to actually show up physically and hopefully mentally. On the other hand, in online settings, it's easier to hide. But we have to also understand that the anonymity provided by online distance settings can be a great leveler. I mean, like, we've all had situations where we have a face-to-face classroom where you have 2 or 3 learners who are really confident and who are extroverted and who are, like, who like to hear the sound of their own voices and who might completely dominate discussions, or, like, be the ones who ask all the questions or answer all of your questions. And there are others that might feel left out and unseen. And having something be online, especially asynchronous, can really level that playing field. And it can mitigate the 7-11 rule that we see in face-to-face settings. Now, 7-11 it's pop psychology. I think it's pseudoscience because there isn't really data to back it up. But the idea that in the first 7 seconds of meeting someone, you unconsciously form 11 assumptions about them. And that happens with face-to-face meetings. And so that can be mitigated in asynchronous or even synchronous online settings because of the communicative distance involved. Moving on. And folks brought this up, that in a synchronous online setting, there are more distractions, especially, like, when people are in work from home or learn from home contexts. Like, you might be disturbed by your children, by your pets, by your family members, by traffic outside, by whatever else is going on. And these are disturbances that usually are mitigated in face-to-face classrooms, but in distance setting, that these are much more, like, problematic very often. And so it's much harder to remain engaged throughout the session than if you all actually showed up face-to-face to see me. And online interactions between you, the instructor, and your students, and between your learners themselves, these have to be a lot more intentional, because, like, with face-to-face settings, you have a lot more chances for informal interactions, like, in the hallway, in the elevator, like, while waiting for class to begin, at the end of class, and so on. So a lot more informal interaction is possible face-to-face that is harder to replicate online, because online you have to be so much more intentional. And related to that, things that you can do on the fly in face-to-face settings require careful planning and premeditation online. So you have these wonderful, spontaneous, teachable moments when you're, like, lecturing in front of a class. And though that can be harder to come by online, easier in synchronous settings, but especially in asynchronous settings, it can be harder, or at least a little more awkward to be able to grab these teachable moments. Moving on. And finally, moving to transfer context, like, which is basically, like, where does the learner get to apply what they have learned during instruction into their real world context, at work, at school, at home, wherever. And the rule basically is that the clearer and the more immediate the transfer context, the more the engagement. I mean, I talked about this in terms of, like, taking a self-defense course while living in a high crime area versus learning Swahili when I live in Kansas. So the idea that we want to make our tasks and assignments such that they can meaningfully transfer in a clear and immediate manner to real world settings and contexts. That helps us improve engagement among our students as well. Moving on. Finally, another theoretical lens I wanted to apply to interpret the responses I received is the idea of cognitive load. Now, cognitive load comes from cognitive science, the field. And John Sweller talked about it in 1988, and he talked about 3 kinds of cognitive load: intrinsic, external, and germane. Intrinsic cognitive load is the inherent difficulty of the content, the objectively inherent difficulty of content. So you can say that the intrinsic cognitive load of calculus is higher than arithmetic, or for an English speaker, the intrinsic cognitive load of learning Japanese is harder than learning Spanish. There isn't much we can do about the intrinsic cognitive load of given content. I mean, it's just there. It has to be acknowledged, and it has to be, we'd be cognizant of it, but beyond that, there isn't much we can do. However, we can mitigate it by leveraging germane cognitive load, which is basically stuff that's in the content that can actually be used to make the content more accessible. To give you an example, there is this amazing, anybody interested in learning Spanish, I would recommend Maria Madrigal's Magic Key to Spanish. It's a yellow book available on Amazon, and she does an incredible job at teaching Spanish to speakers of other languages. And one of the first things she does is she lists like 1,000 words in Spanish that appear in English as well. And to say basically that, listen, English and Spanish have so much in common in terms of their Latin source vocabulary that there are already so many Spanish words you know. You know what educación means, you know what constitución means. I mean, to give you some examples. And so that's germane cognitive load, like, seeing what is in the content and seeing how that can be leveraged to make the content more accessible. However, here, when it comes to engagement, we aren't as concerned with intrinsic or germane cognitive load as we are with external cognitive load, because external cognitive load directly impacts engagement. And what is external cognitive load? It is the noise, the stuff happening outside of the content that makes it harder or easier to deal with the content. So basically, bad design, bad instruction is part of that. And so if you want to go to the next point. So external cognitive load is related to poor instructional design and inappropriate instructional strategies. And these are things in our hands that we can actually fix. So the idea is that the content is hard enough by itself. If we can remove the external noise around it, we can make it easier for students to engage with the content. Moving on. And so how do we reduce or eliminate external cognitive load? One of the most important ways to do it is user-centric course design, especially in an online environment. How do we establish clear communication, a consistent structure, intuitive navigation, logical sequencing, and appropriate choice and selection of instructional media and instructional strategies, both teacher-centered strategies and learner-centered strategies. So all of this forms part of user-centric or user-friendly course design, and that helps us dramatically reduce the levels of external cognitive load that our learners have to deal with. And that frees up space for and cognitive resources for reflection and engagement. Moving on. Another way of reducing external cognitive load is to enhance cognition and retention via the multiple encoding of information. That's just a fancy way of saying present content using different kinds of media. Have textual descriptions, have images, because a picture speaks 1,000 words, have animations, have audio, have video. The more ways in which you encode information while transmitting it, the better the retention and absorption of said information. Moving on. And it's also important for us to establish and maintain a consistent online presence when we are teaching an online course. And that really helps with engagement. that we must be accessible and responsible to students via multiple means. And so finally, here are some points that came up in our discussions that I think are important for faculty and administrators to consider as we move on institutionally in terms of figuring out, like, how do we achieve optimal learner engagement in this post-pandemic pedagogy context that we all are in right now and going forward for the foreseeable future. One of the fundamental questions, and this goes back to orienting context we talked about, why are our students choosing online learning? In many cases, the answer is because they have no other option. Either the course or the program is only offered online, or they are physically located in a different state, a different country, and there's no way they can do this face-to-face, or simply that it's a lot more convenient to do this online because I can learn in my pajamas. I don't need to find parking. And so it's useful for us to kind of explore as to what are the motivations that kind of make our students choose online learning over face-to-face learning. And once again, this is tricky in a post-pandemic world because so much stuff is now mandatorily or only or exclusively online. Another question, what impacts our own sense of urgency and motivation as teachers to enhance learner engagement in our online courses? Now, we have to understand that we are in a Research One university. I have worked at multiple universities in my career so far, and I've worked at R1s, and I've also worked at teaching-centered, comprehensive regional universities. And over there, it's a lot clearer in terms of the expectations of good teaching and how that impacts your own career advancement in that institution. Whereas in a research institution like ours, very often faculty have this perception that teaching is not valued or teaching is not prioritized as much as research and scholarship and grants and publications and all of that stuff. And so is that why we might feel less sense of urgency and motivation to actually work on learner engagement? And if so, what can we do about it? How do we start talking about this? And this is related to the next point. What kind of institutional support do we need from the university, from our colleges, from our departments, in order for us to be able to, more effectively engage our students online? How do we find time to accomplish better online course design? How do we find the time to improve the aesthetics of our Canvas pages? To give an example, how do we find the time to figure out what is the most intuitive navigation to construct, to design? And how do we make our courses mobile device friendly? Because I mean, these days, with online learning, with distance learning, students expect content to be available in multiple formats and across multiple platforms. They want to be able to learn using their phones. They want to be able to learn on an iPad, on a laptop, on whatever. And so how do we cater to those needs? And it's very important for us to think about these and the next question as well, which is, do we have the resources? Do we have the time, the support staff, and the equipment to be able to create high quality media, for example, high quality instructional videos for each of our modules? And why are we asking these questions? It's because we are competing in the post-pandemic world. We are competing with dedicated all online schools for students. And many of these dedicated all online schools, especially the for-profit ones, they have dedicated a lot more resources into instructional design, into course design, into visual design, into navigation design, into cross-platform design than we are doing at traditional brick and mortar universities. And so given that the post-pandemic environment has sort of leveled the playing field somewhat between us and those competitors, we have to ask ourselves, how do we up our game in these areas? And what do we need in order to be able to do that in terms of institutional change? are we able to schedule social time into our online courses without taking away from instructional time? You will notice that I mentioned the word time a lot here. Like, do we have time to do better design? Do we have time to create high quality media? Do we have time to schedule social time? Because going back to the trust issues, the trust, the faith, the safety issues, the more social time we're able to create for our learners to get to know us and to know each other, the less those issues start to matter, because trust gets built that way. And however, we only have so many hours in the day, we only have so many contact hours in a week. Are we able to do that without taking away from instructional time? And this question comes up a lot, like, what exactly is the optimal balance between synchronous and asynchronous learning? Because each has its pros and its cons. Some students love synchronous, some students love asynchronous, and a lot of it might have to do more with logistics and convenience than actual, learning. However, how do we figure this out? And because a lot of us would like to know, so that what is the optimal balance? And so I wanted to end the formal presentation there, because that gives us around 20 minutes to open this up and to have you all engage with me and with each other. And so the next slide is basically about any questions you might have, any thoughts that this presentation might have generated in you, or any observations that you would like to share about effective online learner engagement based on your own praxis, based on your own professional experience, and things that you have read and heard from people about. I wanted to open this up for that, because what's the point of talking about engagement if I don't engage you, right? It would be kind of hypocritical. So please go ahead and engage. I know it is a lot of information I threw at you, but anybody? Okay, let me ask a question. Those of y'all who are instructional faculty, what are the biggest challenges that you have personally encountered in trying to ensure optimal learner engagement in your online courses? If you all want to share, that would be great, because then we can all learn from it.
Dr. Subramony, I'm thinking about some of my experiences. I have not myself taught an online course, but I've TA'd several times for online courses, especially during the kind of the earlier in the pandemic. One thing that I have not yet found kind of the right answer how to mitigate this is when you're teaching and you have all those blank screens, and I completely understand, why we give our students the option whether or not they turn their cameras on or not. And I like that we give them the autonomy, given that they're in their own private space and things like that. However, it can be very, very just disheartening when you feel like you're lecturing out into the void. You're not getting any of that validation from your students. I don't even know, is it connecting with them? Are they understanding? Are they even listening? So I'm asking generally, does anyone have recommendations for kind of how to mitigate some of those feelings of frustration or things like that, or if anyone's had similar experiences?
Let me just jump in here before we open it up to the rest of the group. I wanted to kind of just share something that kind of relates to what you talked about. I mean, this is an excellent point that you raised. And I have to say, personally, I was trained the hard way in terms of dealing with this, because I was pushed off the deep end, literally. And let me explain how. So back in 2005, I started my first position at Utah State University. And my task was to teach via distance. And this wasn't teaching via using a learning management, like an LMS software like Blackboard or Canvas. This was synchronous satellite television. So I was literally speaking into a camera in an empty room, which was being broadcast to satellite centers all over the state and even in Nevada. And so I had these students that I never saw while I was actually lecturing, and I couldn't even hear them because there was no two-way communication. So I couldn't even ask them questions. They couldn't ask me questions, and we just didn't have the technology for it at the time. And so all of that had to be done later, asynchronously via email or whatever. And so we had like a listserv for the class and so on that we could use for that. But yes, the idea of sitting there for 3 hours a week, talking into a microphone and staring at a camera, that really sort of like, it desensitized me to the idea of looking at blank faces or blank screens while talking. But it's a hard process and it takes some getting used to. That's my take on it, because as you very rightly mentioned, we cannot expect our learners to have their cameras turned on because it might be a violation of privacy. Anybody else wanted to jump in on that?
Can I jump in real quick, Deepak? Can you hear me?
I hear you
Mhm.
just fine. Yes.
Okay. I agree and I respect students' privacy. I do. I also encourage them all to turn on their cameras. And, I teach a class with about 40 students in it, and I generally have 2 or 3 cameras turned off and the rest are turned on. And I think the one way that we do that is by building relationships with our students. And that is inviting them into our private space. So, when I'm teaching, last year, for example, my brother was in the ICU for 64 days with COVID. And since I was an online teacher, I was able to spend time in the ICU with him. So I taught my classes from the ICU. And I brought my classes into that environment to let them know what I was dealing with. So this building professional relationships or personal relationships with your students is a really critical thing. I think in a classroom, we can do that face to face, modeling how we treat each other and respect our students. It's harder in a video environment, in an online class, but I still value that face to face. So I want to see their face, and I let them know I want to see their face. I'm not going to penalize them or deduct points or make assumptions about them if they choose not to turn on their camera, and I'm not going to call them out. But I do encourage them to do it. And it starts off slow, get half of the students start with their cameras on, and then more and more turn it on as time goes along. So I really make that effort to get to know my students and to encourage them to be a part of our community. And a part of our community means sharing who they are. And that's the way we can create the best learning environment. So just my thoughts.
I mean, that speaks directly to what we talked about, trust building, that the idea that it's so much easier to build relationships and trust face to face, and doing it online is a lot harder. It takes longer, and it takes more effort on the part of everyone concerned.
Right.
So yeah, definitely. Yes. I mean, the optimal situation is that everybody has the cameras turned on and we're able to authentically as possible interact in that manner. But there are certain, once again, going back to the orienting context, there are certain issues, certain factors that really are sort of beyond our control. And I'll give you a very, very specific personal example, which is kind of embarrassing to share, but hey, I don't feel unsafe in this environment right now, so I'm going to share it. I personally, whenever possible, when I'm not teaching, when I'm just attending a Zoom meeting, I like to keep the camera turned off because I hate the way my chin looks on camera. Because, there have been cases where people have actually had plastic surgery to change their appearance so that they look better on Zoom. I'm not kidding you. Right. And so what I'm trying to say is that there are all kinds of reasons why people want to have the camera turned off, and some of it might be just far beyond our comprehension. However, we dealing with adult learners, we still have to sort of understand that not to take it personally if someone refuses, in spite of repeated entreaties, to keep the camera turned on, because they might have reasons that we're not aware of, and that are frankly not our business.
Yeah, no, I got you. I agree with you 100%, Deepak. I just was kind of trying to present an alternate.
Totally, absolutely,
and,
absolutely.
And I think there's a middle ground somewhere. Like I say, don't ever penalize somebody. Don't ever criticize or call them out on anything, but encourage. And there's nothing wrong with that, I think. So anyway, absolutely. Deepak, thanks for sharing this. I know you've shared this in the College of Education. I missed that presentation, so I'm glad I was able to see this one.
Thank you. And this is exactly the kind of conversation I'm hoping we can have here. I mean, that's what this time is for. This is good, well spent time when we talk about these kind of thorny issues that are hard to kind of come up with an easy answer to, and for which there are so many sides to the story to consider. Absolutely. Thank you, David.
I was gonna so my online class, I don't have the benefit of having some kind of a synchronous meeting time with them. So it's fully asynchronous.
Yep.
And I have upwards anywhere between 150 to 200 students in this class. It's an MAT class, right? And so that was a huge struggle because I'm a relationship person. Like that's a big deal to me in my classroom. And I really struggled with how to make that work in the asynchronous environment. So a couple of things that I did, mainly because I needed it, right? But I figured if I need it, then there's probably some of them that need that too. But I started providing a weekly like welcome video each week. And so like on the main home page is like my welcome page. And so each week I record a really quick little, most of the time it's off the cuff. I don't craft a script for this because I just want it to be, you know, me and from the heart. And so I talk a little bit about like, oh my gosh, like your you know, assignments last week, these were some of the big reflections I saw, or I was so appreciated what, you know, James said about this. And I try to connect, you know, with them that way. I try to share out, we have like a class discussion board that's just open. So if anybody's posted on that, we talk, you know, I might mention that and say, hey, go check out what, you know, she had to say. So that little welcome video gave them a glimpse of me, right? Those interactions with me beyond just the module that they had for me, you know, and there's a lot of different media in the module text. There's video from me, there's video from other people's, but it just kind of, it was a more casual way for them to interact with me. And then I also created an optional Zoom every week, you know, once a week. And it was a time when we came together, we checked in with things, and I typically did some things that I couldn't do online, right? So we engaged in some routines or structures that you know, that we might want them to do in their classrooms. I teach future teachers, right? So, you know, going through that, allowing them to experience it as a learner, and then talking about how could they use these things, and or even just reflecting on their learning from class, any questions that they have. I always wrap up the Zoom session with questions and celebrations, so they can share about things that are going well, any questions they have, things like that. And the first year, and this is only my second year to teach this online class, but the first year I had about 85, I had anywhere between 60 and 85 people on my calls that first year. And then this past year I had between 40 and 60 each night. And of a class of 150, like, I think that's pretty good, right? But it was just this idea that we had that time together, and I think that's important for everyone. But I know I really was struggling with how to make those connections in that asynchronous environment. And so that was kind of why I asked. Cheryl mentioned about the discussion boards. Mainly, I asked, like, you know, like, my students are tired of discussion boards. They are discussion boarded out. And it is not an effective way in my class for them to engage all the time, right? And so I had to really rethink, what am I using the discussion board for? If I'm asking them to write basically another paper in their discussion board, then it doesn't need to be a discussion board. Like, the discussion board should be a prompt, you know, something that they can discuss, in my opinion, right? And so having that mind shift really helped my discussion boards become something a little bit different than what they were used to seeing. And I don't expect them to be an entire paper long, you know, like some people are like, your word count and and all that. And I got rid of all of that, and really made it a little bit more of an informal kind of way to check in on their learning, and things like that. So anyway, I'll shut up.
No, thank you for that. I mean, that really helped, that really added to our discussion here. And I wanted to start off by saying I wish I'd interviewed you as part of my study. That would have been awesome. And I might still do that. So like, you know, so do, like, look out for an invite. what you said about the weekly welcome video and so on, and the periodic optional Zoom session and that open discussion board, that goes back to what the other respondents said about having a consistent schedule of communication, that people know to look forward to that weekly introduction video and maybe a Friday summation video, or like, or the fact that every month on the 15th at 8 p.m. we have this optional Zoom session. And that consistency of communication channels really helps with engagement, and you're doing a terrific job on that, obviously. Now, the discussion board issue, I wanted to kind of talk about it, like, briefly. It's like Zoom, it's like PowerPoint. It's like basically like it's a joke at this point in terms of just how much people dislike discussion boards. And one of the questions that came up a lot with that, I mean, I didn't have time to put it into the main thing, but how do we and when do we and should we as teachers intervene in discussion boards? At what point is it appropriate to do that? And at what point is it not appropriate to do that, especially in an adult learning setting like the ones that we are working in? Because we don't want to feel that students are being like, silenced, or that our voice is being imposed on theirs, like, whether we mean to or not. On the other hand, we also don't want it to go off on a tangent or go off in like, unproductive directions. And so that's one of the issues, like, the instructor participation is a very important question with discussion boards. And talking about alternatives to discussion boards, people have actually come up with interesting alternatives. Like, I had multiple people tell me that they go onto SpeedGrader and they go into the comments section and they use that as a place for a one-on-one discussion with individual students about not just the assignment, but also about like, everything else happening. And apparently that's working pretty well for them, because students actually appreciate having that option, because like, they don't have to intentionally go and write you an email, but they can just do it like, while looking at their grades. And so, yes, there's just a lot of things people are doing creatively to kind of go away from death by discussion board. We have 3 minutes. Yes.
I am teaching an online class for the first time that's truncated, so that it is 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. And in terms of engagement and breaks, like it is synchronous. I am wondering if anyone has suggestions in terms of ways to increase that connection, increase that engagement, considering the different structure that it's an intense and it's really heavy content too, because we're accredited program. So does anybody have any thoughts on ways to increase engagement, or even get that getting to know you kind of thing? I've done, like Kahoot things about me, and I've had people come and be required to come and talk to me, for 10 minutes just to get to know you. But thoughts from anybody?
Let me just quickly jump in here. I have personally found that using those theoretical lenses to approach engagement has really helped. When I think about like, how do I like, reduce external cognitive load? How do I support constructivist and social constructivist learning? How do I like, how do I adjust my instructional context, and how do I be cognizant of orienting context, and how do I recognize the importance of transfer context? All those things really help me in terms of structuring my approach to the engagement issue with online courses. Briefly, I wanted to say that, and because I saw April's hand go up, so I'd like to give her a chance to say.
Well, I just wanted to say that breakout rooms, do you employ breakout rooms, and having assigned monitors for the breakout rooms? And there's some settings where you can go from room to room and sort of visit the breakout rooms. And I think that's a way to kind of break up. I can't imagine sitting and staring at a person delivering a course for 3 hours at a time on an online environment. I think it'd be really taxing. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, that's what I would do.
Thank
I've
you.
done some things with online professional development that are lengthy like that. And, you know, I might have the, instead of having them do like, well, in a professional development, you don't necessarily have them do homework, right? But you like, I give them time to read, you know, short excerpts or stuff. And what we do is we turn our cameras off while we're reading. And then when you're finished, you turn your camera back on, and that signals to me that you're ready to move forward. Right. And then even in the breakout rooms, doing things like that, where maybe they have a collaborative, you know, PowerPoint or document, or, you know, something that they're trying to create, or some kind of a collaborative project, right? That they come back and then they could share it. And then you're not the one like teaching the whole time. And maybe, you know, they're sharing that too. So I don't know if that helps, or, you know, thinking about how we translate what we do in the in-person classroom to online is really something that I have grappled with and tried to find ways to find similar things in my online setting too. So
Thank you.
You. Well, we are officially out of time. I'm happy to sit and chat if anyone wants to, but then don't feel compelled to stay beyond. I once again apologize for the time we lost initially in terms of figuring out the entire screen share issue, but then I think we did manage to get a little bit of like, you know, quality interactive time here, and I'm really glad for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Subramony. If everyone could join me in thanking him for an excellent talk today. This is an issue that I don't think is going away, so I really appreciate you coming to share your thoughts with us today. If you all would like, I've dropped a post-event survey link in the chat. As a reminder, you can earn a professional development certificate or a fellowship, and you can get credit towards that by completing that survey. And as a reminder, we also do have that scholarship of teaching and learning showcase, and Ashley's dropped that link in the chat. Proposals are due by April 12th, but we would love to hear your ideas or any research you've done related to teaching and learning, when we come together in early May to share those thoughts and ideas. So thank you again for a wonderful event, Dr. Subramony, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
And please keep in touch. Don't be strangers.